One second, a young boy was walking home from school, his mind filled with the small joys of childhood. The next, his world plunged into darkness. His heart stopped beating, his body lay cold and lifeless, and his family braced for the unimaginable. But just as the shadows of despair closed in, something happened that no one could explain. He returned, not just from the brink of death, but with a message, one so strange and powerful that it would leave everyone questioning everything they thought they knew. What did he see in those moments between life and death? Who sent him back, and why? The answers would leave an entire community shaken and desperate for answers. Life was simple for the boy and his family. Their small house sat in a quiet neighborhood filled with tall trees and the sound of children playing after school. The boy, only 12 years old, was the heart of the family. His laughter filled every corner of their home, brightening even the dullest days. His parents, though, were always busy. His father worked long hours in an office, and his mother managed a hectic schedule, trying to balance work and home. They loved their son deeply, but their busy lives left them little time to spend with him. Their days were packed with meetings, deadlines, and worries about bills. Faith, or anything beyond the physical world, rarely crossed their minds. But there was someone in the house who saw things differently. The boy's grandmother was an elderly woman with soft gray hair and kind eyes. She had lived through tough times and carried a deep belief in God. Every morning, she sat by the window in her favorite chair, holding a Bible with pages worn thin from years of reading. Her prayers were soft but steady, a routine she never missed. "God is always with us, even when we don't see him," she would say to the boy as they shared quiet moments together. She told him stories from the Bible, filling his mind with images of miracles, love, and hope. The boy didn't always understand her words, but he loved listening. Her stories felt like warm blankets on cold days, bringing him comfort and peace. Though the boy loved his grandmother, he didn't think much about faith. He enjoyed his simple life, playing soccer with friends, riding his bike through the neighborhood, and eating his favorite meals cooked by his mom. His world was full of small joys, and he had no reason to think it would ever change. But his grandmother often worried about the family. She could see how far they had drifted from faith. She prayed every day for them, especially for the boy. She hoped that one day they would understand the power of God's love. The boy's life seemed perfect on the surface, but change was coming. None of them knew it yet, but an ordinary autumn afternoon would soon shatter their routine and send them on a journey they could never have imagined. It was a crisp autumn afternoon, the kind of day when the air felt cool and the streets were covered with yellow and orange leaves. The boy, cheerful as always, was walking home from school. His mother had called earlier, explaining that she was tied up with work and couldn't pick him up that day. "You'll be fine, sweetheart. Just take the usual route," she said over the phone. The boy, feeling proud to be trusted with the responsibility, grabbed his bag and set off. He whistled a tune as he walked, the weight of his books bouncing on his back. The streets were busy, as they always were after school. Cars honked, people hurried by, and the distant hum of city life filled the air. For the boy, it was all so familiar. He enjoyed the rhythm of the city and the independence of walking home alone. But fate had a different plan that day. As the boy approached a busy intersection, he noticed something unusual. A loud rumble grew louder, cutting through the everyday noise of the street. He turned his head just in time to see a large truck barreling down the road. The driver was frantically honking the horn, trying to warn people to get out of the way. The boy froze. Time seemed to slow as the truck sped closer. People on the sidewalk screamed and pointed, but their voices felt distant, as if muffled by the roaring engine. His feet felt like they were stuck to the ground, unable to move. Then it happened. The truck's tires screeched as it tried to stop, but it was too late. The impact was quick and brutal, tossing the boy's small body into the air before he landed on the pavement. His school bag fell to the ground, its contents spilling out onto the street. The world seemed to hold its breath. Onlookers stood frozen, their faces pale with shock. Someone screamed, "Call an ambulance!" Others rushed to the boy's side, but he lay still, his bright eyes now closed. When the ambulance arrived, paramedics worked quickly, their faces tense. The boy's heartbeat was faint, barely there. The sirens wailed as they rushed him to the hospital, but deep down, everyone feared the worst. At the hospital, doctors did everything they could. The The room was filled with the beeping of machines and hurried commands. After what felt like an eternity, one doctor finally stepped back, shaking his head. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "He's gone." The words hung in the air, heavy and unbearable. The boy's parents arrived moments later, their faces twisted with grief. His mother collapsed into his father's arms, sobbing uncontrollably. The father, usually a pillar of strength, stood in stunned silence, his eyes fixed on the lifeless body of his son. But amidst the sorrow, one person refused to give up. The grandmother, clutching her Bible tightly, knelt by the boy's bedside. Her voice trembled but remained firm as she began to pray. "Lord, please hear me. Bring him back. Show us your power," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. Her prayer was a plea, a cry from the depths of her soul. And as the minutes stretched on, something extraordinary began to happen. The room was cold and silent, the kind of silence that felt heavy, pressing down on everyone present. The machines that had once beeped steadily were now quiet. The boy's small body lay motionless on the hospital bed, his face pale and still. The doctors exchanged glances, their expressions filled with resignation. For them, this was the end. But for the boy, it was the beginning of something unimaginable. He felt himself floating, weightless and free, as if he had left his body behind. The pain from the accident was gone, replaced by a strange calmness. The room around him began to fade, and a soft light appeared in the distance. It wasn't harsh or blinding. It was warm and inviting, like a gentle embrace. Drawn toward the light, he found himself walking down a path unlike anything he had ever seen. Stars sparkled overhead, casting a glow that illuminated everything around him. The air felt pure, and a sense of peace filled him. He wasn't scared, he felt safe, as if he belonged there. Ahead of him, the light grew brighter, revealing a figure standing at the end of the path. As the boy approached, he realized it was a young boy, around the same age as him. The stranger had a kind smile and eyes that seemed to hold an entire universe of understanding. "Welcome," the boy said, his voice gentle and soothing. "I've been waiting for you." Confused but curious, the boy asked, "Who are you?" The figure's smile deepened. "I'm your brother." The boy froze. He didn't have a brother, at least not one he knew of. But as he looked into the stranger's eyes, something deep within him stirred. Memories he didn't recognize came rushing forward, like whispers carried by the wind. "You were just a baby when I left," the figure said softly. "But I've always been watching over you." Tears welled up in the boy's eyes. He didn't understand how this was possible, but the connection he felt was undeniable. Before he could ask more, the light behind his brother began to shift. Another figure emerged, taller and more radiant, surrounded by an overwhelming sense of love and authority. It was a presence he couldn't explain, but instinctively knew. Jesus Christ. The boy's knees felt weak as he looked at the figure. Jesus' eyes were both kind and serious, filled with a depth that seemed to see right through him. He didn't speak right away, letting the boy take in the moment. Finally, Jesus said, "You are not here to stay, my child. Your journey is not over." The boy felt a mix of emotions, peace, confusion, and a longing to remain in this place where everything felt perfect. "But why?" he asked. "Why me?" Jesus stepped closer, placing a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. "You have been chosen to deliver a message. Go back and tell them this. I am coming sooner than they think. But if humanity does not change its ways, they will face great suffering." The boy's heart raced. The weight of those words felt heavy, yet he couldn't deny their importance. Images flashed before his eyes. Wars, disasters, people crying out for help. It was a glimpse of a future that seemed both terrifying and inevitable. Before he could respond, the light began to fade. The boy tried to hold on, but he felt himself being pulled back, away from the peace and warmth. His brother's voice echoed softly, "You're not alone. Remember, we're always with you." The next thing he knew, he was back in his body. His chest rose with a sudden gasp of air, and his heart began to beat once more. The doctors, frozen in shock, could hardly believe what they were seeing. The boy was alive. The operating room, once filled with the quiet hum of machines, erupted into chaos. The doctors had been standing in solemn silence just moments ago, preparing to record the time of death. But now their eyes widened in disbelief as the boy's chest began to rise and fall. "He's breathing!" one of the nurses exclaimed, her voice breaking the heavy stillness in the room. The lead doctor, a man who had seen countless cases in his career, leaned over the boy. His heart was beating, a faint but undeniable rhythm. The room, so recently steeped in despair, now buzzed with astonishment. For over 20 minutes, the boy had shown no signs of life. What they were witnessing went against all logic, all medical explanation. Outside the room, the boy's parents had been waiting, their faces pale and tear-streaked. His mother sat in a plastic chair, her hands trembling as she gripped her husband's arm. His father stood beside her, stoic on the surface but visibly shaken. When the door swung open, the nurse rushed out, her expression a mix of shock and joy. "He's alive," she said, barely able to contain herself. "Your son is alive." The mother gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she looked up at her husband, who was equally stunned. They ran into the room, not caring about the startled glances of the medical staff. On the bed, the boy opened his eyes slowly. His face was pale, and his body was weak, but his gaze was calm and clear. His mother threw herself down beside him, her arms wrapping around him gently, as if afraid he might disappear again. "Oh, my sweet boy," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "You're here. You're really here." His father stood at the foot of the bed, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. For the first time in years, he prayed silently, thanking God for the impossible gift of his son's return. But it wasn't just the boy's life that had been brought back, it was his spirit, now carrying something far greater. He looked at his parents, his grandmother, who had rushed into the room with her Bible clutched to her chest, and the doctors who stood frozen in awe. "I saw him," the boy whispered, his voice weak but steady. The room fell silent. All eyes turned to him as his words hung in the air, heavier than anything spoken before. His grandmother stepped closer, her eyes wide but filled with hope. "Who did you see, child?" she asked gently. "I saw Jesus," the boy replied. "He sent me back with a message." Gasps echoed around the room, disbelief mingling with amazement. His mother shook her head slowly, tears still streaming. "What do you mean, sweetheart? What message?" The boy's gaze turned serious, far beyond his 12 years. "He said, I'm here to warn everyone. He's coming back sooner than we think, but people have to change. If they don't, terrible things will happen." The grandmother knelt by the bed, tears streaming down her face. "Praise God," she whispered, her voice trembling. She gripped the boy's hand tightly, her faith reaffirmed in a way she had never imagined. The doctors exchanged uneasy glances. They couldn't deny what they had witnessed, a miracle, plain and simple. But the boy's words brought an unease they couldn't quite explain. For the parents, the miracle of their son's return was enough to spark something long forgotten. They held hands tightly, silently acknowledging that perhaps there was something larger at play, something they couldn't yet understand. The boy, though weak, felt a quiet strength inside him. He didn't fully understand the message he carried, but he knew it was important. He had been brought back for a reason, and his journey was just beginning. The boy sat propped up in his hospital bed, his body weak, but his mind sharp. His parents hovered nearby, their eyes filled with concern, while his grandmother sat close, clutching her Bible as though it were the only thing keeping her steady. The room was quiet, except for the occasional beep of the heart monitor, but the air was thick with anticipation. The boy's mother spoke first, her voice trembling. "Sweetheart, you said you saw Jesus. Can you tell us what happened?" The boy took a deep breath, his small hands gripping the edges of the blanket. "It wasn't a dream, Mom," he said softly, but with a certainty that made everyone lean in closer. "I was in a place, it was so peaceful, so full of light, it felt like home." He paused, glancing at his grandmother. Her eyes were locked on him, silently urging him to continue. "I saw a boy there," he said, his voice wavering slightly. "He told me he was my brother." His parents froze. His mother's face paled as she exchanged a stunned look with her husband. How do you know about him?" she whispered. "We've never told you." The boy nodded, his expression serious. "He told me himself. He said he's been watching over me. But he wasn't the only one there." He took another deep breath before continuing. "Then Jesus came. He looked at me like he already knew everything about me, and it didn't scare me. It felt like he loved me more than anything. He said I had to come back, that I had something important to tell everyone." "What did he tell you, son?" his father asked, his voice thick with emotion. The boy's eyes grew distant, as if he were seeing the scene all over again. He said, "I'm coming sooner than they think, but people need to change or terrible things will happen." He showed me things, wars, disasters, people crying. It was like the whole world was falling apart. His words hung heavy in the air. His mother covered her mouth, tears streaming down her face, while his father stared at him, struggling to process what he had just heard. His grandmother, however, closed her eyes, murmuring a quiet prayer. The doctors entered the room a few moments later, checking the boy's vitals. They glanced at each other uneasily, having overheard some of what the boy had said. One of them, a young man with skeptical eyes, finally spoke. "You've been through a lot, son," he said gently. "Sometimes when people will go through something traumatic, their mind plays tricks on them." The boy met the doctor's gaze, his expression unwavering. "This wasn't a trick. I know what I saw." The doctor sighed, writing something on his clipboard. "Rest for now. You've been through enough." After the doctors left, his grandmother leaned closer, her voice low but firm. "Don't let anyone make you doubt what you saw, child. God has chosen you for something special." The boy nodded, but deep inside, doubt began to creep in. How could he, just a child, deliver such a message? Would anyone believe him? The next few days in the hospital were filled with questions. Friends and neighbors visited, eager to see the boy who had come back from the dead. Many asked about his experience, and though some listened in awe, others dismissed his words as the ramblings of a child who had been through an ordeal. But the boy didn't waver. Despite the doubt and the whispers of disbelief, he repeated his message to anyone who would listen. Jesus is coming back soon, but we have to change. We have to do better. His grandmother, ever his anchor, told him, "Don't worry about who believes you or who doesn't. Your job is just to tell the truth." And so, the boy prepared himself for the road ahead, not knowing how hard it would be or how many lives his message would touch. The boy returned home a week later, his body still weak, but his mind clear. His parents had prepared his favorite meal, hoping to make him feel comfortable again. But the house felt different now. It was quieter, heavier, as though everyone was waiting for something to happen. The boy, however, seemed calm. He had started spending more time sitting by the window, staring at the sky as if listening to something only he could hear. His grandmother often joined him, her Bible resting on her lap. They didn't always talk, but her presence reassured him. Then, one evening, as the family sat around the dinner table, the boy spoke up. "There's going to be a storm," he said suddenly, his voice steady but soft. His mother frowned. "Storm? There's nothing on the news about a storm, sweetheart." The boy shook his head. "It's coming. It's going to be bad, but our house will be okay." His parents exchanged uneasy glances. They didn't want to dismiss him, not after everything he'd been through, but it was hard to take his words seriously. His grandmother, however, didn't question him. "We'll pray," she said simply, her voice filled with quiet confidence. The next day, the sky darkened earlier than usual. Clouds rolled in, thick and menacing, and the wind picked up speed. By evening, a powerful storm swept through the area. Trees were uprooted, roofs were torn off, and streets were flooded. The damage was widespread, just as the boy had said. But miraculously, their house remained untouched, not even a single shingle displaced. Word of the boy's prediction spread quickly. Neighbors began to visit, their curiosity turning into cautious belief. Some came out of gratitude, while others sought answers. "How did you know?" they asked. The boy didn't have an explanation. "I just knew," he replied. As days turned into weeks, the boy began experiencing more visions. Sometimes they came as dreams, other times as sudden flashes of knowledge. He spoke of events before they happened, small things at first, like someone's car breaking down or a friend getting an unexpected visit. But then, the visions became more serious. "There's going to be an earthquake," he announced one evening, his voice trembling slightly. "Not here, but far away. Many people will get hurt." His parents were hesitant to believe him, but his grandmother nodded. "We'll pray for them," she said, placing her hand over his. 2 weeks later, the news broke. An earthquake had struck a country on the other side of the world, causing devastation. The boy's prediction had been eerily accurate. His parents, now unable to ignore what was happening, began to look at their son differently. He was no longer just their little boy. He had become something more, someone with a purpose they couldn't fully understand. As the boy's predictions continued to come true, more people began to pay attention. His quiet neighborhood turned into a place of constant activity. Cars lined the streets, and strangers knocked on the door, eager to meet the boy who had defied death and seemed to know the future. Some came seeking answers, others looking for hope. But not everyone believed. "What if it's all just a coincidence?" a skeptical man whispered during a gathering outside the boy's house. Kids have wild imaginations. Maybe he's just lucky. The boy heard the whispers, but he didn't let them bother him. He focused on the people who came to him with open hearts, those who truly wanted to understand. Yet the weight of his mission grew heavier each day. His parents tried to shield him from the growing attention, but they couldn't stop the reporters. Journalists from newspapers and TV stations began showing up, cameras and microphones in hand. They asked endless questions, trying to uncover a story they could sell to the world. "Do you think you're special?" one reporter asked, thrusting a microphone in front of him. "Why do you think you were chosen?" The boy, sitting on the porch with his grandmother, looked up at the reporter. "I don't think I'm special," he said simply. "I'm just doing what I was told to do." The response baffled the reporter. "Who told you?" The boy's answer was clear and unwavering. "Jesus." The room fell silent, save for the scribbling of pens and the click of cameras. Some reporters looked skeptical, others intrigued, but the boy didn't care. He had spoken the truth. At night, when the house finally grew quiet, the boy often lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Doubt began to creep into his mind. Why had he been chosen? He was just a kid. How could he possibly carry such a heavy burden? He worried about saying the wrong thing, about failing the mission he had been given. His grandmother noticed his unease. One evening, she found him sitting on the back steps, his head in his hands. She sat down beside him, her voice soft and comforting. "What's troubling you, child?" "I'm scared, Grandma," he admitted. "What if I mess up? What if people don't listen?" She placed her hand on his shoulder, her grip firm but gentle. "God doesn't choose the strongest or the smartest, child. He chooses the willing. You don't have to do this alone. He's with you every step of the way." "But what if I fail?" the boy asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She smiled, her eyes filled with love. "You're not failing, William. Every word you speak, every truth you share is planting a seed. It's not your job to make it grow. That's for God to handle." Her words brought him comfort, but the challenges didn't stop. Some people began to accuse the family of making up the story for attention. Rumors spread that they were seeking fame or money. The boy's parents, who had initially been skeptical of his message, now found themselves defending their son. "This isn't a trick," his father said firmly during a town meeting where questions about the boy were raised. "We didn't ask for any of this. We're just trying to do what's right." But not everyone was convinced. The skepticism hurt the boy, but his grandmother's words stayed with him. He reminded himself that his job was to share the message, not to force anyone to believe it. One night, as he knelt by his bed, he whispered a prayer. "God, I don't know if I'm strong enough for this, but if you chose me, I'll try my best." The prayer felt like a weight being lifted. For the first time in weeks, he fell into a deep, peaceful sleep, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The boy's message began to travel far beyond his small town. Stories of his miraculous return and the warnings he carried reached neighboring communities and eventually spread across the country. People from distant cities and towns started arriving, hoping to hear the boy speak. Some came out of faith, others out of curiosity, and a few simply to disprove his story. The family's front yard became a gathering place. Strangers sat on the grass, waiting patiently for a chance to speak with the boy. His parents tried to manage the growing crowds, often overwhelmed by the sheer number of people, but the boy never turned anyone away, even when he felt tired. If they came all this way, they deserved to hear, he told his mother with a quiet determination. One day, a woman from out of state approached him. She carried a worn photograph of a young man in a military uniform. Her hands trembled as she held it out. "This is my son," she said, her voice breaking. "He went missing last year. Do you think he's with God now?" The boy looked at the picture for a long moment, his heart heavy with the weight of her grief. Finally, he nodded. "He's at peace," he said softly. "He wants you to know he's proud of you and that it's okay to let go." The woman burst into tears, clutching the photograph to her chest. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice filled with a mix of sorrow and relief. It was moments like these that reminded the boy why he couldn't stop, even when the burden felt too heavy. Not everyone who came was kind, though. A man in a dark suit arrived one afternoon, his tone sharp and demanding. "How do you explain all this?" he asked, gesturing to the growing crowd. "Do you really expect us to believe you've been chosen by God?" The boy met his gaze calmly. "I don't expect you to believe anything," he said simply. "I'm just telling you what I was shown." The man scoffed, shaking his head. "This is a waste of time," he muttered as he walked away. But even his departure didn't rattle the boy. The boy's grandmother watched all of this with quiet pride. She often sat by his side, offering silent support. One evening, as the crowds finally thinned, she spoke to him. "You're doing good work, child," she said, her voice full of love. "But you need to remember to take care of yourself too. God doesn't want you to burn out." The boy nodded, but he couldn't ignore the growing feeling that his mission was far from over. He had seen things, visions of war, natural disasters, and suffering, that haunted him. He knew his message wasn't just about individual change. It was about a collective awakening. One night, as he knelt in prayer, he felt a new vision forming in his mind. He saw a great crowd of people standing together, their faces filled with hope and determination. But he also saw others turning away, their expressions hardened by disbelief. The contrast was stark, and it left him wondering if his words would be enough to make a difference. His grandmother found him sitting by the window later that night, staring into the darkness. "What's on your mind, child?" she asked, her voice gentle. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm doing enough," he admitted. "What if the message doesn't reach everyone? What if it's too late?" She placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "God's plan is bigger than any of us can understand," she said. "You're planting seeds, and that's all He asks of you. The rest is in His hands." Her words brought him a sense of peace, but the urgency of his mission remained. He knew there were still many people to reach, many hearts to touch, and though the path ahead seemed daunting, he was determined to keep going.